44 officials served at the highest levels of the executive branch. They were confirmed by the Senate. They held constitutional authority. Most of them now refuse to support a return to power. That is a fact. It is measurable. It is documented. And it is not normal. Cabinet officers are not commentators. They are institutional actors. Their role is to advise, restrain, and legally execute presidential power. When they step away in silence or speak out in warning, the signal is systemic. It suggests stress inside the machinery of governance. Not disagreement over policy, concern over process, over limits, over legality. The Constitution assumes loyalty to law before loyalty to any individual. It depends on that ordering to function. When executive authority pressures institutions to bend, the system relies on internal resistance. When that resistance becomes public, it indicates the boundary was tested. This moment reflects more than political fallout. It reflects a breakdown in trust between the presidency and the institutions meant to contain it. The question is not who opposed whom. The question is why those entrusted with power declined to endorse its return. That question begins with the record itself. Out of 44, only 4. Out of 44 cabinet-level officials, only a handful have endorsed a return to power. That ratio matters. Cabinet officers are Senate-confirmed. They swear constitutional oaths. Their silence or refusal signals institutional judgment, not personal grievance. These officials were not marginal figures. They held authority over defense, justice, intelligence, diplomacy. When nearly an entire executive team withholds support, it suggests systemic concern, not about policy outcomes, about process, legality, and restraint. In modern governance, former cabinets usually close ranks, even after contentious presidencies. Here, they did not. The absence of endorsement functions as negative testimony. It reflects lived experience inside the executive branch. Exposure to decision-making, exposure to pressure, exposure to limits being tested. The scale of rejection indicates breakdown in trust between executive authority and institutional stewards. It also undermines claims of loyalty as governance currency. Loyalty without reciprocity weakens state capacity. The consequence is reputational damage to executive credibility, internally, externally. For future appointments, this record becomes a warning label. Power exercised without institutional confidence becomes harder to staff, harder to constrain, and harder to legitimize. The vice presidency exists to ensure continuity within constitutional bounds. Its authority is defined, not discretionary. Certification of electoral votes is a procedural duty, not an adjudicative power. Pressure to alter that process is pressure to negate statute. The refusal to comply was not political defiance. It was legal compliance. When that refusal triggered public denunciation, the conflict shifted from politics to constitutional order. The vice president became a check by design, not by ambition. The episode exposed a demand for personal loyalty, overriding legal obligation. That demand collided with the separation of powers. It also revealed the fragility of norms when enforcement relies on individual resolve. The failure to immediately protect constitutional officers during civil unrest further strained executive duty. Executive power carries obligation to preserve order, not exploit ambiguity. The aftermath redefined the vice presidential role as an active constitutional firewall. Once crossed, that line could not be unmarked. The refusal to endorse afterward reflects institutional memory, not resentment, not strategy, a judgment formed under constitutional stress. The breach of the Capitol was not an isolated security failure. It was the culmination of institutional stress. Months of delegitimizing certified electoral processes weakened public trust. When the seat of legislative power was physically overrun, multiple systems failed at once. Law enforcement preparedness, executive response timing, command clarity. The constitutional transfer of power depends on order, not force. Delay in deploying clear executive authority created a vacuum. In that vacuum, violence filled the space. The failure was not only operational, it was structural. A sitting executive must act to defend co-equal branches. Hesitation under crisis erodes the perception of lawful authority. Once a mob enters the constitutional process, the line between political dispute and democratic rupture disappears. The episode demonstrated how quickly institutional safeguards can buckle when executive responsibility is deferred or denied. The certification of electoral votes is governed by statute and precedent. State results are finalized before they reach Congress. The vice president's role is administrative. Pressure to discard lawful votes introduces personal discretion where none exists. That mechanism, if normalized, would allow future executives to nullify elections without evidence. The effort to compel rejection of certified electors bypassed courts, legislatures, and state officials. It attempted to compress power into a single office. That concentration contradicts federal design. Electoral systems rely on diffusion of authority to prevent capture. When that diffusion is challenged, the entire system destabilizes. The pressure campaign revealed an attempt to reframe legal loss as procedural flexibility. That reframing, if accepted, would permanently weaken electoral legitimacy. The resistance came not from political opposition, but from constitutional constraint. Once tested, the boundary held. But the attempt itself established a precedent of risk. Institutions survived because individuals refused to bend them. That survival should not be mistaken for resilience without cost. The proposal to deploy active-duty military forces into domestic cities marked a direct challenge to established civil-military boundaries. The armed forces are structured for external defense, not routine civilian control. Law and precedent restrict their use inside the country to extreme circumstances. Invoking such power for crowd control or political signaling distorts that purpose. When military presence is suggested as a solution to civil unrest, the implication is coercion rather than governance. This creates legal risk. It also creates long-term institutional damage. Civilian populations begin to associate military force with political authority, not national defense. Once that association forms, it is difficult to reverse. The resistance from defense leadership reflected adherence to statute and historical restraint. It also demonstrated the role of cabinet officials as buffers between presidential impulse and lawful execution. The Insurrection Act exists as an emergency measure, not a tool of convenience. Its threshold is intentionally high. It allows federal intervention when states cannot or will not protect constitutional rights. Expanding its use without meeting those conditions undermines federalism. It also centralizes coercive power in the executive branch. Pressure to invoke it, absent legal necessity, signaled a willingness to bypass negotiated solutions and state authority. Such invocation would have set precedent for future deployments based on political perception rather than legal criteria. The refusal to proceed was an act of institutional preservation. It maintained the distinction between military authority and civil governance. Once senior officials who enforce that distinction are removed, the restraint becomes optional. The structural concern is not the statute itself, it is the normalization of its misuse. When emergency powers become routine, democratic systems degrade quietly. The warning from defense officials reflects awareness of that trajectory. The Department of Justice functions as a legal institution, not a political instrument. Its legitimacy depends on insulation from executive demands. When claims of election misconduct were raised, internal reviews were conducted. Prosecutors examined allegations. Investigators assessed evidence. No findings supported claims of outcome-changing fraud. At that point, institutional duty required closure. Pressure to reopen investigations without factual basis would have transformed law enforcement into a political weapon. That line was resisted. The refusal mattered. It demonstrated that prosecutorial discretion cannot be compelled by presidential insistence. Once that boundary is breached, legal neutrality collapses. Justice becomes selective. Enforcement becomes contingent on loyalty. The episode revealed how close that boundary came to failure. The cost was internal fracture. The benefit was institutional survival. Independence held because individuals enforced it, not because the system automatically protected itself. Claims of widespread fraud were not casual statements. They carried legal consequences. Courts require evidence, affidavits, verified facts. Those were not produced at scale. Judges across jurisdictions rejected filings. State officials certified results. Federal agencies confirmed election integrity. Continuing to assert fraud after institutional review created conflict between narrative and law. When executive authority insists on a version of reality rejected by courts, governance enters dangerous territory. The insistence pressured agencies to validate falsehoods. It also pressured officials to contradict their own findings. Refusal to do so resulted in removal or resignation. The pattern exposed a preference for affirmation over accuracy. In democratic systems, elections conclude through process, not assertion. When losing outcomes are reframed as illegitimate without proof, future elections become conditional. Acceptance becomes optional. The danger is cumulative. Each unsupported claim lowers the threshold for the next. The resistance from legal institutions preserved finality, but the attempt established a template for contesting lawful outcomes through pressure rather than proof. National security decision-making depends on structured process. Briefings, intelligence synthesis, interagency review. When choices are made outside that framework, risk increases. Decisions influenced by personal incentives distort strategic assessment. Adversaries study predictability. Allies depend on consistency. Reports from senior advisors described a pattern of impulsive judgment, limited engagement with briefings, and susceptibility to flattery. That combination weakens deterrence. It also increases exposure to manipulation. Foreign policy becomes transactional rather than strategic. When national interest is filtered through personal validation, long-term commitments erode. The danger is not a single decision. It is the cumulative degradation of process. Once established, that style propagates downward. Subordinates adapt, dissent narrows, critical information is filtered to avoid conflict. Over time, the system produces confirmation rather than analysis. That shift is difficult to reverse and costly in crisis. The first term contained informal restraints. Experienced officials delayed directives. Legal counsel narrowed language. Career staff absorbed pressure. Those mechanisms were not codified. They relied on presence. When those individuals exit, the restraint exits with them. A second term, structured around loyalty rather than expertise, would alter internal balance. Compliance would replace challenge. Speed would replace review. Emergency powers would face fewer internal objections. The issue is not intent, it is capacity. Institutions designed to slow decision-making would be bypassed by alignment. Guardrails do not fail all at once. They erode through staffing, through norms, through repetition. When leadership treats resistance as disloyalty, the system learns to stop resisting. That creates a different executive branch, more centralized, less self-correcting. The structural risk lies in continuity without constraint. Once normalized, reversal requires crisis. The record is now established. Constitutional limits were tested. Institutional norms were strained. Legal processes were pressured. In each case, resistance came from inside the system. Vice presidential authority was challenged. Military restraint had to be enforced. Prosecutorial independence was defended. Electoral certification survived because individuals refused unlawful demands. These were not abstract debates. They were real stress tests of governance. The failures were not total, but they were close. What remains unresolved is structural. Systems that rely on personal courage are fragile. If future administrations remove internal restraint, the same safeguards may not hold. The precedent has been set. Pressure works until it does not. Next time, the outcome may differ. This is not a partisan conclusion. It is an institutional one. Democracies erode when norms are treated as optional. The warning is already documented in testimony, in resignations, in silence. If you value clear analysis grounded in law and power, subscribe to stay informed.